Hi, everybody. Welcome to Couch Counsel. I'm here with my colleague, Andy Sherrod. We are no longer from the couch, back to talk with you today about vaccination policies in the workplace. So, Andy, I'm just going to get us started here with the first question. Can employers mandate vaccines?
Great question, Jamie. You've been getting that one a lot. The short answer is yes, they can. The EEOC has been very clear in its guidance that mandatory vaccine programs are allowed under the law. A couple things to consider. This should go without saying, but of course, if you're going to implement a mandatory vaccine program, make sure that you are implementing it in an even-handed manner so that you're not treating folks that are similarly situated differently. But also there are two important carve-outs that all employers need to be aware of. First of all, if an employee has a sincerely held religious belief, the employee needs to be accommodated unless it's an undue hardship on the business. Also, if the employee has a medical condition that could qualify under the federal ADA or state disability laws, employers also need to consider reasonable accommodations in that situation as well. But otherwise, mandatory vaccine requirements are allowed.
So, Andy, what do you think about mandatory vaccine policies versus voluntary vaccine policies? What sort of questions have you been seeing from clients?
Yeah, I think that employers are really struggling with this one, and it really does just depend on the particular company and the particular workforce and environment that the company is operating under. The benefits of a voluntary program, they do avoid some of these thorny legal issues in terms of accommodations or requirements surrounding what types of information you can ask your employees. You can avoid those issues by making the program voluntary. Also, voluntary programs can be a little bit better for morale because employees aren't being told what to do by the company. But on the downside, voluntary programs do take buy-in from the workforce to make sure that they work. And so if folks aren't volunteering to be vaccinated, your company could see vaccination rates that are lower than you would like to see. Also, I've seen clients have had some difficulties policing these voluntary programs, because, some folks just try to get around the system. Examples I've heard are folks that, might have been pretty vocal in terms of not being vaccinated, yet aren't abiding by the rules surrounding, social distancing or masking requirements that are typically imposed on folks that aren't vaccinated. So, given those sort of factors, I'm seeing more and more clients consider going the mandatory route.
Andy, you mentioned earlier the two carve-outs for medical exemptions and sincerely held religious beliefs. So I thought I'd talk just briefly about what employers should be considering when those issues come up. Again, we're back to the interactive process when you get those kind of objections, and that process is geared towards determining what accommodations, if any, are needed. For medical objections to the vaccine, you can ask the employee to provide appropriate documentation from a healthcare provider that states the nature of the impairment, how long the accommodation might be needed, and the extent to which the impairment conflicts with the vaccination policy. For religious objections, employers should tread carefully here. They're allowed to ask questions about an employee's beliefs and objections, but the law has a very broad definition of religion, and it protects even unique beliefs that are not held by many. And so, employers should be careful not to challenge anyone's beliefs, but instead sort of ask more general questions such as, identify the religion or belief that supports your reasonable accommodation request. A few other tips, Andy, I would recommend keeping these types of discussions confidential. Sometimes vaccine education can help. Employers shouldn't be in the business of providing medical advice, but they can certainly pass along guidance from the CDC. And as you mentioned earlier, consistency is key here. Employees in similar positions need to be treated similarly, and employers can get into hot water when they don't do that.
Great advice, Jamie. Staying on the subject of accommodations, as we all have experienced, a lot of folks have been working from home over the last year or more. Is that now a required accommodation?
No, the short answer is no. Many of us have been teleworking, but the EEOC has explained that just because of the fact that some of us have previously teleworked, that does not mean that we always get to do so into the future. Once again, as you mentioned, this is a reasonable accommodation request, and the employer needs to engage in the interactive process to determine if it's feasible and to make sure that it doesn't impose an undue hardship on the company. These are, of course, fact-specific determinations. Once the workplace reopens, if somebody is requesting to telework as a reasonable accommodation, that is not a request that has to be granted if it requires excusing the employee from performing an essential function of their job. Couple other tips here, Andy. Employers should consider developing or updating their remote work policies and, clarifying protocols for working at home to make sure that they're guarding against things like unauthorized overtime that can become problematic.
Yep, sounds great, Jamie. The interactive process is certainly key here on all these decisions. And lots to digest for all Virginia employers on these vaccine policy issues, probably more than we can even cover in one episode. So I think we should get together again and talk about some more details on the logistics of implementing your vaccine program, but that'll be for next time. In the meanwhile, thanks to everybody for tuning in. See you next time.